All right,
Okay.
and now go back to the more and hide the floating meeting controls.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go for it, Gerald.
Okay, so what I think I'd like to do first is set a little bit of context. What was I doing in the middle of a natural disaster that you were watching on your television screens, which I would not see for a week until after it had happened? Um, my wife and I moved to Western North Carolina in 1976. We intended to buy a piece of property and build a house and more or less do the back to the land thing, kind of running through the culture at the time. And we did. We rented a house on a farm and had no idea that we would end up lifelong friends with our landlord and his parents and his children, to the extent that we ate Christmas dinner with their family for 27 years in a row, even after we had left our home. So we had deep connections in this community. When we moved there, we were among the few younger people because there were no jobs. We didn't have sense enough to figure that out before we went. But there are lots of people then who are my age now, and those were our neighbors. And we got pretty well integrated to the extent after I'd been there maybe a year and a half or 2 years, I would get a phone call saying, please come up to the church. We need to dig a grave. That was, to me, it was an honor because it was a badge of acceptance. When we first moved there, we were definitely outsiders. We got integrated into the community and developed meaningful relationships. We moved there because it's a beautiful place, right in the middle of Blue Ridge Mountains. And so we hadn't been there during the fall, which is really many people's idea, the nicest time of the year to be there. The weather's generally pretty good, and the fall foliage can be spectacular. It isn't every year, but it can be. We hadn't been there in the fall for 30 years, and this year we decided that we were going to do that, and wanted to get there by October 1st, and actually got there a little bit earlier than that. I crammed in a big camping trip up to the Arctic Ocean from middle of August to middle of September, got back and headed to North Carolina and got there 2 days before Hurricane Helene arrived. Got there to an empty house and went out and bought a couple of $100 worth of groceries to get started on a Wednesday. And on Sunday, we threw over half of it out because we had no power and no refrigeration. So I couldn't figure out how to insert the video in PowerPoint. There was a place I wanted to do it, but it won't hurt anything to go ahead and show it.
Okay.
It's not a great video. I'll explain that. So I made that with my iPhone 6, standing in the upper floor of our house, looking out the south window. And I was frankly afraid to be there.
Please share the screen.
In the timber. And trees were coming down. You could hear them all over the place. Later, I learned that we had lost 67 trees on our 14 acres, up to 30 inches in diameter. Lots, several thousand board feet of eastern white pine, red oak, beech, hickory, hemlock. We've had hurricanes in the area before, but never with the kind of wind and never with the kind of rain we had. So we can go to the slides and
Where's that darn view?
Dennis, it's the one, if you look up on the top bar, it's the little box that looks like a TV. Yeah, that one.
Okay. So the hurricane came on September 28th, Friday morning. It was windy all night, and then about 6 o'clock in the morning, started to rain harder. It kept raining harder and harder, and the wind really blew between about 6:30 and about 9 o'clock. It just rained like nuts up until about 10 o'clock, and then kept raining for a while after that. It would be helpful, I think, if I explained the topography. We're, I don't know, 300 miles from the Gulf Coast where the storm came ashore. The temperature of the Gulf of Mexico is about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than normal. The hurricane brought a lot of water with it, and it came to the escarpment of the Blue Ridge Mountains and rose. And as it rose, it cooled, and when it got to the top, it got to the coolest point. Our place is in Yancey County, North Carolina, which has Mount Mitchell on its southern border.
Excuse me, Gerald. Colleen has a question.
Yes,
Well, I'm just concerned, are we supposed to be seeing something here?
No.
Not yet. Well, you
Not
should be
yet.
seeing Hurricane Helene, Western North Carolina, 2024.
No, your screen isn't shared.
Oh, it isn't?
Yes, it
No.
is.
I can see it.
just fine.
Yeah, I see it.
I
see
only
it too.
Wow. Okay, never mind then. I don't see it. I only see Dennis.
Oh, weird.
I'm looking to see what you have for view.
Okay, go ahead, Gerald.
okay.
Okay,
So, Mount Mitchell is at the southern end of a range of mountains called the Black Mountains. They're all over 6,000 feet, which doesn't sound high here, but they're very steep mountains, and the valleys are very narrow. And so this warm, moist air came up the escarpment, gets to the top where it's much cooler, and that water fell out. And it had nowhere to go but into this narrow V-shaped valley. And it flowed into the headwaters of the South Toe River. And when we think of river flooding here, we think of like the Chehalis or the Skokomish, which have very broad valleys. This was not the case. Narrow valley with a very steep gradient. So the water flows fast. I mean, 20, 25 miles an hour. It takes whatever's in its way. So we can go to the first slide. This first few set of images come from our community within 1.5 miles of where our house is. This was the fall foliage that we had hoped to see, except most of the tree leaves are already off the trees because the winds blew them off for the most part. Go for another one. This is the road that goes, gravel road that goes down to our house, and still some leaves on these trees. This is what we were hoping to see when we went. Go ahead, Dennis. This is on the top of a ridge above our house. One more. And this is a barn on that same gravel road going down to our house. This property joins ours. So this, this is why we were going in the fall to experience this kind of thing. Most of these, I think, after the hurricane, because first few days after the hurricane, there was not a lot of time for picture taking. So go ahead, Dennis. On the Thursday afternoon, 27th, we walked down to the river. It was only about a quarter of a mile from our house. It had already been raining a lot, and we were curious to see what the level of the river was. And this is where it was. This is a cabin that is on stilts because its predecessor washed away in the flood of 77. So this is the same view after the storm. So if you think about the Nisqually River that you see from the Glacier Bridge in Mount Rainier National Park, you see usually a very small amount of water. You see a lot of rocks both sides of it. Because the river occasionally gets that big. Well, that's what happened here, except for having rock beds that have been there for probably thousands of years. It's civilization. When people settled this area, they used the water forces as a means to access the interior of the mountains. Not that they were canoeing up them, but that was the most level path into the mountains. And there were some bottom lands like this. This belongs to our friend, my prior landlord and lifelong friend. There is some flat land there, and he basically made his living on this piece of property for over 50 years. So people came into these narrow valleys for whatever flat land there was for the access, built their houses there. Later, when commerce started, little store buildings were along the creeks or junctions of creeks along the river, and towns grew. And they were all right in the path of what happened. You go ahead next. This is this was Sunday afternoon after the Friday of the hurricane. I decided that I was going to walk down the river, but I couldn't get there, and I'll show you why in a minute. At any rate, I went over the hill behind our house, which is really steep, and then down to this road and walked along this road, which would be the next several images. This was in the middle of the road where there was still some of the road left. It's hard for me to imagine there are any fish left in that river after it happened, but I have seen kingfishers. Pretty good sign. They think something's still there, so let's hope. This was the home, that fragment of the school bus was the home of the woman who lived there. Vehicle on its side is a relatively new Jeep. And she escaped in the middle of the night, wearing the clothes on her back, and went to a neighbor's house on a little higher ground. When we left, it still looked just like this. Next.
Like bottom left corner. No, it's not showing now for still, but there it is.
So you found all kinds of stuff. I thought this sign was particularly ironic. It had come to rest up in a tree. For those of you who can't read it, it says, "Be still and know that I am God." And it's exactly the angle it was sitting at in the tree. Dennis, this gives you a sense of the distribution of woody debris that the river left receded. Just acres of this sort. In this place photo, you can see the mud line up on the railroad, gravel bed. This is a portion of the railroad that survived. There's a section, this is a railroad that's operated by the CSX Railway Corporation. It used to be the Clinchfield, Ohio. It had one main job, which is to haul coal from a mine in Elkhorn, Kentucky to a power plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Power plant converted to natural gas and the rail traffic dropped, but did not quit. Now there are a lot of tank cars, sure, for all their hauling. There's still freight through there, and there's about a 50-mile section of this that CSX calls their Blue Ridge Division, and their budget for repairing it is $200 million. See some reasons for that. This is still on the road along the river below our house.
Where was the road?
Where the riverbank is?
No, I was shooting from across the river.
Oh, okay.
This was a bridge that was where that road crossed the river. For all practical purposes, it was the end of the road on our side of the river. Something interesting about this river is during the Civil War, it was actually the dividing line between the Union and the Confederacy, and both sides were in North Carolina. And when we moved here in 1976, the legacy of that was that Yancey County, on the side of the river where we lived, was predominantly a Democrat. And the county on the other side was the Union, as it had been since the Civil War. That has changed now for a variety of reasons. The window that is standing in that debris pile came out of a house 200 yards upstream from it and landed there, and there were no cracks in that window. People in that house climbed out the kitchen window to get up the hill. The house did not wash away, but it definitely flooded. And those sections, the bridge deck, you can see 3 of them there, are about 100 feet long, and they're made of concrete. And so what happened, I believe, was that timber coming down the river piled up against the bridge, and it was a force multiplier, and ultimately the bridge failed. It was a fairly new bridge too, built with modern construction standards.
Was there some kind of pylon in the middle to hold it up?
Yeah.
Probably took that out.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's not there anymore. This is same location from the other side of the river at a later date. Force was just amazing. And this is what was the road on our side of the river. And it was really difficult to walk on. I didn't do it at first because immediately after the storm, the road that turns up toward our house from here, you can see a portion of it. If you look closely, you can see a building. But that was washed out too, but there were power lines down on that. And later I learned it was absolutely safe, but at the time I didn't know that, and I didn't want to suffer electrocution. That's why it went over the hill instead of around this way. That was pretty good walking. It's about 6 feet wide there, and it had been probably a 20-foot wide road. There was also wind, as you saw in the video. And this was a house in our community. The woman who owned it was standing in the doorway when the tree hit. She was not in. The house has now been demolished and burned, and there's a good-sized camper truck. So you're interested in photography, and I am too. So basically, I had 3 cameras with me. I had my Nikon mirrorless, and I had Olympus Micro Four Thirds, and I had my iPhone 6. This is an iPhone 6 photograph. I used all 3 of them because each one had a place. Most of the images you've seen prior to this were made with the Nikon. My background is as a nature photographer. I grew up fishing, camping, hunting, boating, lived my life outdoors. The only new hobby I have in my life is photography, which I started in 2005 with Nikon D7. So I came to this late, but it was my connection with the outdoors that got me started on this. So my main interest in photography has been in nature photography. Dabbled with some other stuff, but it's just dabbling. Nature photography is what I do. Landscapes and some wildlife photography as well. Occasionally, I will do something plant life, but it tends more to be a tree than a flower in a garden. Do. The thing that was really useful about the iPhone is everybody had phones that were snapping pictures. And at some point we get into people. I'm not a street photographer. That would have been a very useful set of skills to have in terms of how you approach people, particularly under duress. But having the iPhone was really, really handy. And I'll point out which photographs were done with that. This one was taken out of my car after I had made a food delivery to somebody who lived down the road. I'm just trying to document what happened in our community. I didn't try to do all Western North Carolina. Most everything you'll see is just within a 5-mile radius of our house. This was. So, this is another example of what the wind did. This is a stand of eastern white pines. See the damage there. Many of them were blown over and lots of others were just snapped off halfway up. Well, the next thing is.
Yeah, a question before we go on.
Yeah.
I see a lot of them there that look as if they just had all the branches stripped off. Do you have any idea whether those will recover?
They're damaged. They'll never be what they would have been.
Well, yeah, I know that.
And, another good question is what happens to all this wood? And the answer is it's going to rot or it's going to burn up in a wildfire. There's so much of it and so little capacity in terms of logging crews and sawmills. And lots of it was on small holdings, and sawmills are reluctant to take trees off small woodlots because they often have things like fence staples in them and just wreck the blades and the sawmills. So oversupply, undercapacity to deal with it. Also, when the wind damages the trees like that, it will often twist them and they will saw into a log and it just comes apart. So,
Is that your house?
no. Our house doesn't actually look like that. It's not like that. These last two were ones when I had a day and really just got out to, I think I'd been by both of these places and the damage struck me as illustrative of what I was seeing. I went back and looked at images. This is another bridge that's out. This next series of photographs comes from the little village of Green Mountain. Green Mountain consists of a post office, which is where our mail came from, a Presbyterian church, and a general store. That's it. So perched right on the side of this river. The building on the other side of the river belongs to the Union Mining Corporation, and it's on a rail siding. It's basically a shipment point for quartz products. Mining has been a big part of the economy of this area for a long time. Feldspar, mica, now super high grade quartz, the kind of quartz that ends up in semiconductors. And it's very high end stuff. You have to have security clearances to get in the plant, but there are no plant tours. And it was a pretty big deal. It was interesting. There's a little bit down the mountain, there's a company called Baxter Travenhall, and they basically produce IV bags for hospitals. And that company produces 60% of them for the country. And over half of their production comes from this area. And then there's another company that makes boom trucks for utility companies. You've seen them, they have, see the guys up in the baskets, and that's what it's, and about half of those trucks are made in this community as well. And one of the nice things was that those companies kept their employees on the payroll with the proviso that they go volunteers. They didn't tell them where.
Cool.
Yeah, so I thought that was good. So at any rate, this is another bridge virtually the same as the first one you saw. And when we left, there's still no way to cross this river. There is another way out, but it's a big detour for people depending on this. Oops, oops. Need to go back. Yeah.
I think my finger is double clicking these things.
Yeah. So this was a pretty creative approach to get back and forth across the river right after the storm with a line and a canoe tethered to it. But there used to be cable ferries there that worked on a rudder. The current would actually cause the boat to get across the stream. The person undoubtedly is using a paddle to orient the canoe so that it would cross the river. This was a shed just a little bit away from the general store. There were scenes like this all over the county. That was actually a mid-60s Chevelle with the somebody's cream puff and baby blue there. It's got flooded and filled with mud and all kind of lost, but all that sand was just deposited there. Still, lots of that. People's houses right by the river just filled. So this little village of Green Mountain, and we weren't able to get there for a couple of weeks after the storm because the road to it was not passable. Got in there, excavators and bulldozers push a lot of sand off the road, and you'll see in a minute that the road is really damaged. All this stuff on the right-hand side of the image was deposited there by the storm, including all those rocks. The river just went there. Debris and all the stuff on the left-hand side of the road is what people got out of those buildings. My understanding is the post office will not reopen. Mail will come through the county seat. Birds. This is the photograph I regard as one of the more important things I took just for personal reasons. I've been out there talking with some people in that little village and turned around and was headed back to my car, which is parked near the van in here. And looked up and the fog was lifting and the sun was coming in. It's a really beautiful place. And one of the reasons we moved there was it was a beautiful place. And then I had just seen this little community that's nearly destroyed. All this debris, yet still a beautiful place. And it was kind of at that moment that the sense of loss really hit me. This was one of the Olympus Piper 4/3, which I like to, because it's so small and easy to carry around, and it's kind of unobtrusive. For me, that was a pretty tough moment. And you can see what happened to the roads. So I get to that. There, I'm sure, still piles of garbage that they're just twisted like spaghetti on a plate. some of it, I'm sure, is where they gathered enough excavators and compacted it, but just amazing piles of it. And wildlife was sort of befuddled for a while. This is on our property. And pines that you see kind fallen in the storm. We really benefited. As I mentioned earlier, I got involved with the recovery effort in several different ways. First thing I did was, after hiking down that road that we looked at first, I realized there were people down there, no way for them to get out, because the bridge was washed out at the other end, the road was washed away closer in, and see, they had a problem, so I went to the volunteer fire department, which is a really important organization. We'll see more about that later, and said, I told them what I had found and offered to go back and try to find who was still there. And you could see some of the houses were really damaged. And as it happened, we were there long before all those houses were here. They used to hunt grouse all over that country. There's hardly any place you could put me down where I wouldn't know where I was. So in the country, I'm a hiker, so I could do this, 7-mile round trip to the end and back and over the hills without any big effort. And I had run a weatherization project for a senior citizen center in that area, so I knew the culture. I knew how to go to the houses where I'd never been before and introduce myself and not get shot. So I offered the fire department to do that, and they said, yeah, go find out who's there, what their ages are, if they have any medical conditions, if they have any critical prescriptions that they're running short on, and find out how long they can last on food and water. I did that. Had some people I really didn't know because they moved in after we moved out, and got to be friends with some of them. But at any rate, did that, and then that was pretty interesting. Then we helped unload relief supplies, truckloads of it. Some pretty amazing experiences. Really astounding to see how much stuff came in really quickly. Almost all of it from church groups. There was a government response, but it was later and different. Almost everything that came in early was private things. And, it's kind of interesting because you're unloading these truckloads of stuff. It's all going by pretty fast, but when you sort it out, I realized without any planning, these folks got it about right. So when we set up a distribution center, it was about as well stocked as a convenience food store at a gas station, but more volume stuff. So we kind of covered the waterfront needs. I did jokingly say that the people down the mountain must think we don't brush our teeth because we have more toothbrushes. Awesome. Anyway, then volunteers started flooding in, and I was down at the bottom of my road. One of my neighbors had cut out our driveway so we could get out. And it's rudimentary, just make a path so you can get the car through. And there's still a lot of stuff down there. So we were down there clearing that out. And this guy comes by in a called side by side. It's an all-terrain vehicle with seats side by side, and usually a little sort of cargo bed on the back. There are 3 or 4 more behind him. He stopped and said, "What do you need?" I said, "I don't really need anything. There are a lot of people here that do need stuff, but I don't really need anything." He said, "Well, Chief sent me down here to see you and to do something for you." I said, "Okay, we can get out and get food and water. But I do have a lot of timber down. It's going to take me all winter to get the road to the top of my property cleared out. Said, no problem, I'll send some guys down here. 2 hours later, 4 guys showed up and they had a skid steer loader. And they went up this road and basically cut these trees, shoved the other stuff off the lower side so you could almost drive a truck to the truck up on the property. They did it in about an hour and a half. And there were people doing that all over. The end of the first week, we knew we were going to be without electricity for a long time. And we weren't prepared for that. And I couldn't find a generator that I wanted anywhere nearby at less than about twice the price. Should be. So I called my sister who lived in Raleigh and she found one for me. We went over to pick it up. Driving down the mountain, we passed a convoy that was 15 miles long of pickup trucks pulling trailers with all-terrain vehicles, backhoes, everything. It's just a massive mobilization to come into this area. Within 3 days, people in the community had one lane open so you could actually get out of the community to a paved road. Within a week, with all these other people in there, we had 2 lanes out on that one road. In 2 weeks, virtually everybody's driveway was. It was just amazing. People just showing up. So, any rate, this deer was before these turkeys. This is not a very good photograph because it shot right through my kitchen window. Look at this backyard, which they normally do. A little more. I cropped several halves of birds out of that frame. Had my telephoto lens. That was helpful. So there was so much damage done along the river. Driving on the highway above it, I could see parts of the river I had never seen before. I had canoed down there, but had never seen it from the road because of timber. So I could also see that there was a section of the railroad that was damaged in a pretty interesting sort of way. And I had probably a Sunday morning, I decided I was going to go photograph that. This was a very intentional photographic experience. I went to a bridge that went across the river, and the railroad runs right by there. I found a place to park my car, started walking, and this was 3 weeks after the hurricane. You can see deer prints and raccoon prints. You don't see any people prints. So I started down the river. The plan had been to walk down the railroad track, but you simply couldn't do it for more than maybe 100 feet at a time because there were trees over it just everywhere. And this was quite a hike. I ended up going about 3 miles, and I'd rather hike 6 miles here on one of our trails than to do that 3 miles again because of having to climb through tree laps, hike down to the riverbank, walk along the sand where I could do that. Pretty arduous. But go ahead and flip through the next. So this is what happened at the railroad. And it's a little bit hard to tell, but those rails, as they curl downhill, around one on the right-hand side's been on about a 10-foot radius. And I don't know if you've ever picked up even a short section of rail. It's heavy, stiff stuff. So it's important to know a railroad is not fastened to the ground in any real way. It's a gravel bed, and then there are ties that float the rails on top of the gravel bed. And rails are fastened down with those connecting plates that you see. What happened was the river got high enough to float those ties up. At some point, it pulled it downstream, broke off sections, and just wrecked the amount of force was just awesome. I went a little past this and I was very nervous about whether the integrity of the bank was going to keep me at the same elevation. I got off that pretty quick. But, yeah, so this was one of the more intentional photographs.
Very artistic.
As a landscape photographer, I'm looking for beautiful stuff. And so this was different because this photographing wasn't necessarily beautiful. This is what I had seen from the road above and wanted to photograph, and I couldn't get there because I had gone as far as I could go at that other one. And I came where the next bridge would walk ahead and walk down here. It's only about a half mile and there was nothing in the way. So it was real easy. It's just strange to stand there, contemplate that could actually happen. It's on the left of that abutment is a little creek, but the creek channel couldn't hold all the water. So under the railroad got washed out. It's happened lots and lots of places.
It's gonna take a while to rebuild that.
Yeah. Wow. Man. So one of the things that was tough was that there was loss of life in this storm. Our county, there are 9 people, 9 dead, 3 students. And so there were teams with cadaver dogs up and down the river several different times. That's a hazmat suit left behind probably by one of those groups. This is the fire department in our community called the Double Island Volunteer Fire Department. This is well after the big hubbub of activity. Initially, we unloaded all the relief supplies that came in into that building on the left. And then the fire chief thought about that and said, we got to get this out of here. Because he knew that people would be coming to get it. Parking lot would be jammed. And if they needed to get a fire truck out, they simply couldn't do it. So he talked to the pastors of a couple of churches nearby, either side of the fire department along that road. And so behind, talked them into setting up distribution centers. So after unloading all this stuff, we then loaded it back up and moved it up to the churches. And when we were involved with, really didn't have good access into their basement, so we were literally handing stuff through the windows in there and filled nearly the same volume stuff. And people were still bringing more, and almost invariably after they drop off a load, they would say, "What do you need?" And I said, "Well, we got a lot of peanut butter and jelly, but we don't have any bread." Next day, we had lots of bread. Just a lot of somebody was coming up from down the mountain bringing a couple 100 gallons of gas a day to put in the tank here at the fire department so we could refuel the generators for people. Just absolutely amazing stuff. And these are the people that ran the fire department. The woman is the granddaughter of somebody who was our next door neighbor. I had never met her, but have real connections to her grandparents still. And her husband was standing next to her. He was an industrial electrician. He had broken his foot right before the storm, which he said turned out to be a blessing because if he hadn't had that, he'd have been out on a chainsaw with all the other guys and he wouldn't have been doing what needed to be done in terms of planning. They were reacting in real time. I'm talking about Dan, the person next to him. He worked for the Charlotte, North Carolina Fire Department for 20 years as an EMT, and has done lots of disaster work here. And it was interesting to talk with him because he said he'd been in a lot of situations like this, never seen a community pull together and exert the level of effort on their own behalf. I thought this really nice to hear. But even as they were reacting in real time to stuff that was going on, they were thinking ahead to what they were going to need next week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks. And just an example of that. So, well, with all the creeks and rivers flooded out, there's going to be a lot of rats coming up out of the low areas, and they're going to be looking for stuff to eat. And we got a big truckload of blue plastic barrels to store animal food, which I thought was pretty thoughtful. They had, I don't know how much hay brought in for people that were keeping a few cattle. It's just amazing. Real leadership. This was the distribution center in the church. And decluttered a little bit at this point. And stuff was fairly organized. Those are 2 high school students. Young woman is the daughter of the woman you saw in the last picture. The young man is a high school student who comes from a very poor family, and he rides the bus from the high school over to the community college every afternoon to take classes over there. His goal is to work in the cybersecurity side of information technology. It's a lot of water. And that was a tiring day when we had loaded all that stuff. It goes back about 40 feet here. A lot of it got taken. We used some of it for sure. And the weather was starting to get cold, and I could envision all this stuff freezing and breaking. So I started inquiring about what we were going to do with it. And I learned that it was not a concern. I had no idea. Practically, it will not freeze. And there are 2 reasons for it, apparently. It took a while to dig this out. It gets super cooled before it's bottled, and it gets filtered to a very fine standard. So with no particulates in it, there's nothing for ice crystals to form. I'm sure it would freeze at some temperature, but I've seen it spend all night outside at 20 degrees and it's not frozen. I had no idea. No idea.
Interesting.
That was a lot of water, and it's heavy too. Within the first week, we started to see organized help coming into the community. So what you're looking at there, and vehicles are the North Carolina National Guard, and the white SUVs are Border Patrol. So federal presence in there. There were helicopters in the air almost constantly. And when I was talking about the section of road that was cut off, some of the people were evacuated out on the helicopters. A few of them working boats there. It was interesting to me. A lot were big military helicopters. You'd see the Chinooks with the 2 rotors, and some smaller ones too, but a lot of private helicopters, which I didn't. I'd still like to know more than I do. I'm going to tell you one very specific thing that happened that really gave me something to ponder. I was at the fire department. They got a radio call saying a helicopter was coming in and they needed help unloading. A little while later, a little red helicopter lands on their helipad. They do have a hill above the fire department. And we go up there. They have 2 boxes kind of simple without something in here quite the same size. Let's say they're about 30 inches cube, two of them. And they weren't terribly heavy. Took them down to the fire department, opened them up, and you had like 8 boxes of saltine crackers, you know, the 4-packs, a couple of rolls of paper towel, maybe a first aid kit, something else, but you know, $30 would have bought everything in either one of those boxes for sure. It costs a lot of money to keep a helicopter in the air, and the road was open to the fire department. So, you know, maybe these guys were doing that out of the goodness of their heart, or maybe they were billing FEMA. I don't know, but the economics of it didn't seem quite right.
It's probably closed airspace or controlled airspace, and that's how they got in to take a look.
I guess. Anyway, that was interesting. One of the other things I did for the fire department was go up every driveway along about a 3-mile section of road to check on people. They'd gotten all the people who lived right down at the road that had driveway. I was way up in the hill one time, and I heard this big noise below me. I realized there was a helicopter underneath where I was, and they had landed in the yard. And I walked down there. I'd seen them go over and look at a 4-wheel drive pickup that was parked in the yard. It didn't look like anybody had been home in quite a while. And they were looking for somebody that they thought they needed to medevac. And they didn't know where they were or anything. And so they asked me if I could help them find where this place was. So I put them in my car and we drove around and talked to people. And in the end, the woman didn't really so much need a medevac. She just wanted somebody to cut the timber out of her drive. It's interesting. It's hard for me to assess the impact of the kind of organized governmental aid that come in. There were a lot of camouflage dump trucks hauling debris. I think I saw a lot of that going on. They sent to this exact location, flatbed trailer with windows on it. And the idea was to kind of work on that road that we were looking at earlier. And they unloaded that bulldozer at the bottom of the hill and pretty much wrecked a pasture portion of it. And rattled down the road and really didn't do anything down there. Left and loaded it back up. So they couldn't do anything with it. And then after that, the fellow that you see in a little bit, I guess, had a contract with the county. And he went down there with a middle-sized construction elevator. And in 2 days, he had it so you could drive a 4-wheel drive pickup from my house to where that bridge washed out. It was interesting. At any rate, so, then there were all these relief agencies. This is the Southern Baptist Texas Convention. And you had 2 trailers. The Cajun Navy came in, and Walmart. This is a Walmart parking lot. They actually paid the cost of relocating these vehicles into their parking lot, and donated a whole bunch of food and other supplies. There were a couple of parking lots that were just dedicated to hardly anything but relief. And you go to the next slide. This is a laundry trailer that Cajun Navy brought in. We used that because we didn't have running water at our house, and after a while we had water in it. It's working and sweating and using up clothes. And it's not a laundromat. They want your stuff, and you give it to them, and you get it back, and it's all folded. It's just amazing. And what you can't see here is that there were shower trailers in the same parking lot. So, several of those like that. 'There. 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 This was on the way to, or way back from Walmart. I wish I had stopped on the way there. Because that parking lot had been filled. I don't think you could have driven a car through it with utility vehicles. Utility company vehicles. They all have mutual aid agreements. It's entirely possible to Sound Energy sent people. When I was in a hurricane in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1996, there were crews from Washington and Oregon. Nobody can handle a disaster the size of this on their own. We have an electric membership cooperative that provides our electricity, and their initial estimate was 600 power poles. Before we left, they had replaced 2,000. They were 3 weeks after they had replaced 3,000. And some of them they could get to pretty easily with these boom trucks. They could do a lot with those. And then they couldn't do it with that. They can set them with a construction excavator, but it takes a lot longer to do that. If they can't do that, they hand carry power poles and hand set them. That's work you just wouldn't want to do because they're really heavy. And the reason they have to be carried is that the terrain is just too steep and rugged to do it any other way. So it's amazing people doing that. Sure. This is before and after. This is the road that you saw initially. You can see all these power lines down. That's why I wasn't going to walk down that. And then this is on the right is after that has been worked over by the fellow with the excavator. His name is, the guy in the orange shirt is Randy Hughes, and his son is named Drew. We spent about 3 or 4 days down here just doing amazing. And now the later bigger crews came in, heavier equipment and widen the road out, but they really made it possible for people to get in. And I just had a lot of respect for people that know their trade well enough to do as much as they did in a shorter period of time.
We want to take a 10-minute break, Gerald?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And I am open to questions too. I should have said that at the beginning.
Harold, I do have a question. Before you received your generator, how do you keep the batteries charged for your camera?
In the car.
In the car?
The only way to keep it.
Did you see any of the pack horses in Campbell and dog fill up and stuff? Also, old. It was horrible. Just saw that. I mean, I can imagine what you went through here.
Okay. Let's get moving again, everybody.
Okay. So, right, we had a question.
Oh, yeah, well, the question is, this looked quite harmonious, the effort that you were
Actually,
showing.
could I interrupt just for a moment?
Sure.
Gerald, could you please try to stand directly in front of the speaker? It's been hard to understand you all the time. And I know
Sorry,
you have a soft voice.
Yeah, I was trying not to stand between the audience here and the screen, but I'll try to
Okay,
do
well,
better.
just move the speaker thing.
Okay.
See, just a second. I can put the extension cord in there.
We're good.
Okay, that
Okay,
would be a
we're
great
good.
idea.
We got it figured out.
Okay.
Oh, well,
Okay.
the question was, we had heard that there were areas of North Carolina in this hurricane afterwards where there was not a very peaceful situation.
Yeah, that was true. We didn't experience that firsthand, but it was a concern. And what I did see was in the early days when we had supplies coming into the fire department, 2 deputies showed up from the sheriff's department. One of them was a young woman who worked for our county, and another was a young man who had come from an adjoining county where the damage wasn't as bad. And they had heard there were threats, and there may have been at other similar locations in our county, but we haven't had any of that. And so at this point, we were all seated inside the fire department, kind of getting the day planned out, who was going to do what. And so this young and sort of officious deputy started in on, have you had any threats? Have, you know, that sort of thing. And at some point he asked, have you got guns? And the fire chief said, we've got a lot of guns, but if there's any shooting to be done, we'd prefer you do it. And it just cracked me up. You know, but we didn't have, where I was, we didn't have any of that. But, you know, while we're on that topic, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that came from places that shouldn't have, to be honest about it. And I think one of the ones I found most fascinating was people were saying you shouldn't apply for FEMA relief because if you sign those papers, the government's going to get your land and they're going to mine lithium on it. And, you know, I was not aware that lithium was amenable to a cottage industry scale economy. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff. And, you know, we heard that there were refrigerated semi-trailers over in Asheville that were just stacked from one end to other with corpses. Well, that wasn't true. There was just a lot of information floating around that was not true, to the point that a person, my acquaintance who works for the electric company, said that some of that stuff had actually interfered with their ability to make repairs to the electrical system. And more recently, we subscribed to a newspaper from there, and more recently, we found out that the county adjacent to ours, which had about the same level of damage, had a very low rate of application for FEMA relief. And now there's funding coming in to the counties, but it's tied to how many applications and for what value had been completed earlier in the process. And so they kind of shot themselves in the foot by responding to misinformation and disinformation. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. And, you know, there were a lot of guns. I got used to standing in a fire brigade line, handing off water or food, and, you know, maybe guy either side of me was wearing a pistol, but after a while I figured out they weren't the kind of people that were likely to shoot me. So, you know, we're all doing the same thing.
Okay,
Okay, we got here.
there we go.
Okay, this is sort of saw a little bit of this earlier. This is my former landlord and friend's river bottom. And we don't have, this would have been a good place for a drone. He has quite a bit of property there and has cattle, and a lot of it is forested on the hillside, and he has fence up there, and he's now 81 years old and slowing up a little bit. So I offered to walk his fence line and assess damage to his fencing. So I got a bird's eye view of this piece of property from the ridge up there. It was just covered with timber, and about 4 acres of it was just covered in rocks about this big that just got left by the river. And there's a power line. If you look closely in the left-hand photograph, you can see it running across there. That's a main 3-phase line that comes across the river at that point. And there was a pole down supporting that line, and a whole lot was depending on getting this line back up. And the utility company sent a crew down in there to set a new pole. They dug through 9 feet of sand before they got to solid ground where they could set the pole. But so 9 feet of sand was deposited in there, and there was timber all over that piece of property. And he was just downhearted. When I first talked to him, said, I think I'm just going to have to load up the cattle and take them to market, because he couldn't see how he's possibly going to farm down there. Let's go to the next slide. You can see there's work been done there. We had one of those super moons, and I decided to walk down to the river one night and see if I could find anything interesting. They had started piling up the debris and burning it. So for those of you interested in technical details, for this and maybe one other photograph, I have a Samyang 14mm manual focused f2.8 lens that I've got as kind of a cheap approach to astrophotography, and it's, you know, got some extra coma in the corners and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, it got me in the game a little bit, and I found other things to use it for. And this was one of them. And I had a tripod for this shot. So going to the next thing. This is a fellow named Brandon Ike, who, along with the other people you've seen, somebody I regarded as a hero in this process. This fellow is a building contractor from Kiowee, South Carolina. He builds houses. He builds about 10 to 12 houses a year and does about $50 million revenue doing it. He's backed off from doing twice that volume of houses and twice that annual revenue. And he, something motivated him to come up and see what he could do. And he went to one of the big centers, and they didn't have anything for him to do. So he went to one of the bigger fire departments, and they didn't really have anything for him to do. And somehow somebody told him to call the fire chief at our department. He did, and he got put to work. He was the fellow that came by and got the guys to go up and clear my road on my property. At any rate, I introduced him to my friend, and he hadn't met him yet, although my friend's pretty well known in the community, but this guy hadn't met him. They kind of hit it off, and he had his bulldozer brought up here and worked for about 3 weeks there, and decided that this bulldozer wasn't big enough, so he rented a bigger one and added in and did tens of thousands of dollars worth of work. Just did it. There's a woman that part of what I did was take care of 4 different people in the community, mainly keeping their generators fueled and starting them for them. They were all elderly. And one of them lives on our gravel road. I hadn't actually known her. She isn't in the best of shape. And she went outside one night to do something and fell down and could not get back up. And there are no close neighbors. Probably nobody within a quarter mile. And at any rate, that was a problem. This fellow heard about that and bought a year's subscription to a Lifeline medical alert device. And the house that you saw that the tree had fallen on, he had an excavator in there, took it down, supervised the burning of it. There is no telling how many hours or how much money he spent doing that. It's just, I enjoyed getting to know him.
It looks like he's enjoying it.
Yeah, he loved it. His crews were still working. He'd call in about once a week. He'd go down to South Carolina and see things were still moving and come back up. But just amazing what people did. This is a house right where that section of road that I showed you that had been torn up. This sits in the curve of that road, and it was flooded up to the eve of that veranda. Yeah, there. So 2 floors of it were submerged underwater. It was filled with
Is that even recoverable or do you just
Well,
tear it
he's-
down?
He's trying to do that. I don't know that I would, 'cause it's not the first rodeo for this house, you know. I couldn't believe it hadn't been completely cleaned out when this image was made. Um, I couldn't believe everything that was piled up outside it had been in it, because there was so much of it. He had some of it bagged up in plastic bags and offered to haul that off in my utility trailer. He must have just had mud shoveled into those bags. He had Samaritan's Purse and some other groups in there helping, but there was one I just couldn't lift. And I said, you know, if you want this gone, you got to put it in the trailer yourself. I can't do it. We took 2 loads and probably at least 3,000 pounds of stuff from there. Okay. This was the main road into town that goes past the turn off to Green Mountain that you saw earlier. You can see they've piled dirt up here just trying to clear it. And you can, on the left-hand side of the image, you can see where the pavement is overhanging. Where any kind of road bed underneath it. Major damage there. The next one. I had seen this work going on. This was a photograph I wanted and went to get specifically and found a place I could park. I was fascinated. You know, we have a lot of I think valuable regulations that govern how we treat our waterways. Some got suspended because they were actually mining rock and gravel out of the river. And you know, I thought about it, and it looked pretty brutal. This is a river where I fish for smallmouth bass. And it's within walking distance of my house. I'm kind of attached to it. And it was, you know, it's just shocking to see excavators loading mining type dump trucks out of the river. And then I thought, well, where else are they going to get rock from? How far are they going to have to haul it? You know, there's an environmental cost to that too. And how long can you wait on all of that too? So, it's just a matter of doing what had to be done. Okay. This is my driveway, and that is a black walnut tree that is suspended by what used to be my power line. And I was a little afraid to mess with that. Just because of gravity. At some point, I figured out the line wasn't hot, but I still didn't have a good way to get to that to get it off. And I knew the power company would sooner or later, which they did. It's now in little bitty pieces in my backyard to go in the little wood stove. Next winter, on to the next one. These are the guys who took care of it for me. I was able to talk with them for a while. They were working 18-hour days. They did get, most of them didn't do that too many weeks in a row because it's dangerous. They're working dangerous stuff and they have to be alert to do it. They really, really worked hard. This was a photograph I can work to get as well. This is across the road from where you saw that excavator and dump truck, and this was the site of the closest fatality to our house. There was a cabin there. We took the cabin away, and the fellow who was in it, he was a musician. I didn't know him. His name is Leonard Wadowski. You can look him up on the internet. He's there. He's fairly accomplished musicians. I still haven't found him. They recovered some people up to 30 miles from where they live. 30 river miles. You go next one. So close up with the memorial, some of his friends left for this. I'm a musician, and this one kind of got. Yeah. That's the bridge that I parked near to go walking along. Had been the railroad tracks. And all that debris, this photograph doesn't really capture the scale of the debris pile, but it had all come off that bridge. For some reason, that bridge stood. It was completely covered in timber. And it took them a few days to get it off so you could drive across. Somebody put that flag up. To me, it was kind of emblematic of the spirit of we're going to deal with this, we're going to get through it. And this is an image I got way back. And it was one of the times I had my equipment in the car and I found a place to park and made this image because to me it said everything's going to be okay. It's going to be a while, but everything's going to be okay. That's one.
That's the end.
Yeah. So, and I was trying to balance my interest in photography with everything else that had to be done. Because there were needs far greater than money to take pictures, but on the other hand, I had a sense that I was living through something that I hope never to repeat, to be perfectly honest about it, and that it needed to be captured in some way. I also kept something of a journal, not every day, but probably maybe 6 or 7 entries through this period of time, and it was my way of processing what I had seen, heard, dealt with, and these photographs are integrated in that journal. I had real technology problems. First off, no electricity, no cell phone service. And the best of times when we're there, my only access to the internet is to use my cell phone as a hotspot. And the cell phone service was, even after it came back, was intermittent and very, very low bandwidth. So just trying to move stuff was extremely difficult. We got a few Starlink setups in the community. See, we got one at the fire department that they use for their internal use for emergency purposes. There was one set up at the church that was a distribution center, and I could get to that one. And then I'll back up a little bit. It was Sunday afternoon after the storm before I was able to make any kind of contact with my daughter in California. So she's watching videos and she knows the area and she knows that our area has been hit hard, but she doesn't know anything about us. And when I went down to take those photographs along that road, I met a fellow who was a caretaker for a guy that owns quite a bit of property down there, who could have survived up there for 2 months without leaving. He had huge solar installation, 2 big gen sets for his house, really equipped. And he had a Starlink set up, and I was able to get an email out to my daughter on that Sunday. And then the next day we were going to go into town because we had heard on the radio that they had set up a Wi-Fi hotspot on the town square that you could use. Before we got there, we saw a sandwich board in front of a house alongside the road saying Wi-Fi hotspot. And this guy that had a Starlink set up. Also had enough parking places for about 10 cars in front of his house, which is really unusual in that part of the world to have that much flat ground anywhere near a house. And he just opened it up. They had a coffee pot out there, and anybody who wanted to stop and use it could. And so I was able to call my daughter after I got my phone unentangled from our new Toyota RAV4, which somehow wrests control of my phone under certain circumstances. And I had to delete myself before I could actually call her. It kept trying to interrupt. Well, that's a real pain in the neck. But the whole communications thing is really interesting because a few people had a satellite-based system that's real low bandwidth, and it went out for whatever reason. I don't know, it should have worked. Our electric membership cooperative has put in fiber, but it went out with all the poles that the electric wires were strung on, so you didn't have that. And absolutely the only thing that worked was the Starlink. I have my own views of that for a variety of reasons, but what I can tell you is it was absolutely, it was the only way you could communicate outside the area for a while. And so the file for my kind of journal and all these photographs was too big to really do anything with till I got back here at better bandwidth. So that was a frustration, just not being able to communicate. You'd never know when you were going to be cut off. And we went by the Verizon office, that's our carrier, and it was a private contractor. I guess some of them are. Anyway, he said Verizon wasn't telling them anything, and other than it might be May before they get full service restored. So, and they did bring in cell towers on trailers that were kind of agnostic as to carriers, but the signal was weak. So that was a real challenge, and probably still is for some people.
Well, when do you go back?
When will I go back?
Yeah,
Probably in the fall.
you fall,
Yeah, late fall.
and then you stay all winter there?
Yeah, probably. I like the winter there. Winter's colder, but more variable. You can get any kind of weather there is during the winter. So any questions you might have?
What's the current situation?
Current situation, I think, is for the vast majority of people, they're mostly back to normal. But for the people that lived along the water courses, it's not normal, and it may never be. Of course, the very worst things were people who lost their lives or lost loved ones. That happened. In the Asheville area, there were roughly 100 fatalities. 9 in our area. Some people's places of employment are not going to reopen. They were close enough. We lost a major supermarket in one of the towns that was close to us, and they probably can't rebuild because it's in a flood zone. Now, it wasn't in a flood zone until we got this particular flood. Now it is. So now I guess they're looking for property to rebuild. It's tough for a lot of people. Some people literally lost the dirt that their houses were built on.
We're gonna ask you, did the rivers change course at all?
Not too much, not too much. Temporarily they did, but gravity being what did, they kind of.
Those long, those steep wall valleys, there's not a lot.
They do minimally, but sometimes I've seen where
Oh,
they'll
yeah.
shift from one side of the
Yeah.
valley,
Right.
they'll move like
Yeah.
200 yards and take out everything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I didn't see too much of that. But the banks have been scoured. in many ways, it's like here in that it's a temperate climate and it's, the amount of rainfall is not too much different from what we get here. It tends to get more in shorter periods.
Mhm.
Overall, it's about the same. And the vegetation grows right up to the edges of rivers and creeks. You don't see stuff like you do here where you have these big boulder fields. And now it's just scoured out. Eventually that will come back. But, dirt has to settle in there, sediment, and just have to take root and grow. So a lot of people are living in camper trailers, and a lot of them have never had camper trailers, and they didn't understand things like if you're going to cook in them, you sure better open the windows because they're not all that well insulated, and it's can be really cold there, and you get condensation. So there are people who've had problems with their plumbing freezing up, mold growing in the trailers. There are people who were probably living in tents before the storm and have been offered housing and are still living in tents. So it's a mixed bag as to how people are doing, but I think for the vast majority of people, things are kind of normal. It was a learning experience for us. I came back with a much more serious attitude about putting together a go bag. What do I need for 3 days? If I have to leave the house in a hurry, which could happen here as easily as it could happen there. I learned the importance of having some cash because when the power goes out, the internet goes out and the credit card systems go out. So the only way we could buy gas or food for a little while was with cash, and I hadn't gotten a lot of it. We were okay, but that was important. I think on the balance, it was a pretty tough thing to go through, but it wasn't all bad. To be in the midst of a community coming together, working together for common cause, focusing on what's really important, came at a time that I thought was a good time for me to feel that. And, I met some people I'd have never met otherwise. We ended up kind of befriending a couple that lived literally right over the hill behind our house. You can walk there, but it's pretty steep. It's better to walk around a quarter or half mile. But they had us over for dinner one night, and we had them over before we left, and there's no doubt we'll see them again. The woman is a local person, and her mother lived about 15 miles away, and she had been able to communicate with her. We were able to take her up to see her mother once we could get out. That's a friendship that will continue. That part is good. And, just seeing the way that people outside the community brought resources in and volunteer labor to help out. It's good. It's what you think should happen and it actually did.
Okay, any questions on, from the people online? Okay, I think we'll call it night. Now all I gotta do is figure out how to stop that
Press the
recording.
escape key and then your menu will come back. Okay. You see your menu at the top, at the menu? At the top there? Or is it at the bottom?
It's at the bottom.
Okay, so then you can stop the recording and then end the meeting.
Oh, there's the stopping. Okay.